One of the greatest philosophers of our time, yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential African Americans in Ebony magazine. To help more people learn about him, please consider liking this video and subscribing. To get useful materials about Dr. Thomas Sowell, please visit the website. Thank you, and let's begin.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty
right
in
now.
Colonialism?
Okay, I hear
the
you.
Reverse, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development.
Oh, okay. Oh, this is dangerous territory, talking about British politics a little bit. I mean, in some sense, makes sense, because England, of course, is in the south and the British Islands, and more advanced, of course. And England and Scotland, I'm not saying it's not as advanced, but I mean, but then you can talk about the influence of English going to Scotland, Ireland, and the Wales. But if he's right, it does make sense, because England has been in the fight of the modern world for hundreds of years. So it does make sense, if that's the case, that if the culture of the Roman Empire and Greek came to those areas, it makes sense. You know, they might have some advancement. Talking about Central America too, there's some of the places that the Spaniards never went there. It's true, they're still poor. They're okay living like that, but they're poor. He might have a good point. I'm not even talking about Africa. That's another topic.
Because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. You know, 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome. But that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland, and then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world, there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think politically it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some independent nations, they say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today. Do you see that, the operation of the multinational corporation, as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before. To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
Now, this excerpt is taken from the book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent geographic advantages that Western Europe has had over Eastern Europe, for example, more navigable waterways leading to the open seas, with Western European rivers and harbors not being frozen over as often or as long in winter as rivers and harbors in Eastern Europe, due to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream on Western Europe. Another major historic advantage growing out of geography is that Western Europe was more readily accessible to invasion by Roman conquerors. Despite the ruthless slaughters in those conquests and the subsequent brutal oppressions by the Roman overlords, among the lasting advantages which the Roman conquests brought to Western Europe were Roman letters, so that Western European languages had written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe did. To the enormous advantages of literacy, as such, Western Europeans had the further advantage of a far greater accumulation of written knowledge in their languages, even after the languages of Eastern Europe began to develop written versions, but still had not yet caught up with the centuries-long accumulations of knowledge written in Western European languages. Literacy.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. All these Eastern European countries that they look a little bit behind in some instance. That not only that, they're still in that war, endless war kind of thing, right? Look at Russia and Ukraine; they're still in war right now. Like they haven't really catch up to times. Of course, the Western side of things is a little bit more advanced in that regard. Not even Russia is equally as advanced as the Western world, and that makes a lot of sense, man. It makes a lot of sense. Talk about the United States. We invaded. We took out of the natives some of the native lands. Even the natives are just taking advantage of some of the technology, the advance of the United States. Puerto Rico, when Puerto Rico was part of Spain, when Puerto Rico was part of Spain, we were not doing as good. I think we, for the first time, we got a piece of the pie before the invasion of the United States in 1898. We were part of, we have a piece of the pie in the parliament in Spain, so we were represented, but we were not as advanced as when the United States came, and what the United States did in such short amount of time, Spain never did in 300 years, right? The advancement, and then you see a lot of Puerto Ricans, they're being very successful. You know, all over the United States, and even the island itself, very successful. With that, of course, you can call it colonialism, but then the advancement of colonialism has flourished to a point where it's unimaginable, right? And when Africa as well, we see South Africa. South Africa is a great example of that. How South Africa is one of the few places in Africa where newly advantage of technology is flourishing.
Was not the only thing that moved from west to east in Europe. So did coins, printing presses, castles, crossbows, paved streets, and vaccinations, among other economic and social advances. But all of this took time, sometimes centuries. Moreover, people from Western Europe, Germans, Jews and others, were often a majority of the population in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the transition, at that point, was to Latin. Only decades later did Poles become a majority of the population in Krakow. The towns of medieval East Central Europe were often cultural enclaves of foreigners, again, mostly Germans, but with many Jews as well, and, in the Balkans, Greeks and Armenians, joined in later centuries by Turks. In short, there has been for centuries, not only a disparity between the opportunities and advances in the two halves of Europe, but great disparities within Eastern Europe itself, between the indigenous peoples of the region, and the transplanted Western Europeans living in Eastern Europe, the Baltic and the Balkans. Neither genes nor discrimination are necessary to explain this situation, though some intellectuals and politicians have chosen to claim that the differences have been due to race and others have chosen to blame social injustices. Many other racial and other groups in many other parts of the world have likewise ended up with large disparities in opportunities and achievements, for reasons that range across a wide spectrum and cannot be reduced to genes or injustices. Thank you for watching this present.
Okay. I would like to know more about the colonialism aspect because it does make sense, especially in Africa. The majority of the countries, not the countries, countries in Africa are independent from European uh, colonialism. My question is, based on that independence, has those places gotten better? And I really don't see. The only one that I see is Zimbabwe and South Africa. Zimbabwe went through some weird stuff in the 90s, late 80s, and South Africa, of course, with all this stuff going on. I don't want to get into the topic because it might be a little controversial. I don't want to get banned. But you can see Johannesburg be a great city, but now, of course, certain things are not there anymore. So the natives are taking over, and of course, things are now going backwards. Yeah, it makes sense because there's a transfer of culture, and the better culture always reign, unless the native want to kick them out, and the native kick them out. They have to just be whole by the consequences. Huh. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I'm not gonna really appreciate it. Am I wrong on this? Am I okay on this? Am I missing something? I might be